Welcome. I'm Jennifer Atkinson. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a professor in environmental humanities at the University of Washington. And I'm also the host of Facing It, a podcast on climate anxiety and eco grief, which I was really hoping I could cancel beginning today. I certainly hope I'm not going to be continuing it as a run over the next 4 years. But I'm also one of the three coordinators, along with Sarah Jaquette Ray and Elin Kelsey of the Existential Toolkit for Climate Educators, which is the group hosting this discussion series. Many of you know Sarah Ray, who's the author of Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, and I believe is going to be joining us, or it's just about coming online here. And then our other coordinator is Elin Kelsey, who's speaking today, so I'll introduce her in just a moment. If you're just joining for the first time, because I know we have a lot of new people going to be logging in today, just to give you some context that these gatherings have grown out of a conference that we held back in July that was supported by the Rachel Carson Center in Munich, which brought together climate educators and activists from across the disciplinary spectrum who are engaged in difficult issues like biodiversity loss and climate injustice. And the idea behind that project is to build an existential toolkit with resources for educators so they can help students build the resilience to navigate the emotional fallout of this crisis. So we are currently building a website that features contributors from, or contributions from those participants. I'll drop that in the chat. It's just existentialtoolkit.com. I've got a couple other things I want to add in here as well. And we're really prioritizing resources and activities that are plug and play materials that people in any discipline or any level of expertise could use in their classrooms or community work. So that should be live in coming months. But in the meanwhile, we're hosting these talks because there was such a spillover of energy from that conference. We really wanted to keep the conversation going, give people a chance to network with others in the field. So the format for today, we're gonna go till 10, but if Ellen needs to log off before others who are still having a conversation, I'll leave Zoom running and you can just stay on as long as you want and talk with your new friends or your old friends online here. But usually the guest facilitator talks for about 20 minutes or so about their work. And then we open it up to an informal discussion with everyone. So there really is a lot of collective wisdom in this group, and we hope to hear many of those voices. So I'll try to moderate and call on folks in order as you raise your hands. And if you can't do that through your interface, you can put something in the chat and I'll call on you to unmute yourself. And in the past, we've also opened by asking everyone on Zoom to introduce themselves and their work, which was doable when there were only 12 of us, but clearly word has been spreading. We have a much bigger group today. We're expecting maybe around 40 or 50. So what I'll just ask is, instead of having everybody introduce themselves up front, if you do speak and you ask a question or make a comment, please introduce yourself then, your name and how you're involved with work on climate emotions. And then also, if you want the transcript of the chat, just send me an email afterwards and I'll forward it to you. So with that, I am very excited to introduce my amazing friend, Elin Kelsey. I can't think of another human being I'd rather be online with today. She is a leading scholar and educator and speaker on evidence-based hope. She is an award-winning author of books for adults and for children. And a lot of her work is on the reciprocal relation between humans and the rest of nature. Especially in relation to the emotional implications of these doom and gloom narratives and how they impact children and adults. So you might have also seen in my email that just last week, her new book, Hope Matters, was released with Greystone Books. I'm going to put that in the chat as well. Hopefully she'll tell us a little bit about that today. And as I was thinking about today on this topic of hope and climate work, I was feeling a little self-conscious because my most recent podcast episode is actually titled, "Is Hope Overrated?" And I will clarify that the content is very nuanced. I dive into distinctions between active hope and passive hope, intrinsic hope, look at Lauren Berlant's concepts of cruel optimism, and then I end with a very rousing call for hope through actions and solutions. But what I thought was so interesting, and it really surprised me, and maybe it shouldn't have all at all, but because of that title, Is Hope Overrated? That was by far the most downloaded and shared and listened to episode of the entire series. I mean, no other episode has come anywhere close. And, you know, of course, it's meant to be provocative, but I think that people's response is a real index of how fashionable it's become to be down on hope within climate circles. I mean, we see these articles and memes everywhere. I was even just thinking 2 weeks ago when the new book, All We Can Save, was released. It was Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine Wilkinson's project. Johnson created a big stir by dropping the F-bomb when journalists asked, this is through the Washington Post, they asked her if she had any hope. So, you know, once again, it really comes down to what we mean by these terms. And I think Johnson's response was also very nuanced if you read past the headline. But I just think that Elin's book could not be more timely. And I'm so glad that we have someone to guide us through this conversation who's actually done the research and has the data on how emotions like hope and despair shape people's responses and mobilize us around climate solutions. So with that, I will hand the screen over to Elin Kelsey.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And thank you so much to everybody for joining this morning. I really appreciate it. I appreciate those of you who are joining us who are feeling a lot of uncertainty at this moment. And I appreciate all of you who are joining us at odd time zones. I just think it's such a generous thing to spend your time collectively like this, and it's great. I also really like, one thing about this group is it's been quite emergent ever since Sarah and Jennifer invited me to join in with them to think about creating a network like this. And one of the things that's been a hallmark of that is being able to reach out to each other for support. And when I was talking to Jennifer this morning, she was mentioning that it could be quite helpful just to have a moment of sort of a breath, you know, a mindful breath perhaps to settle us. And I wondered if there was anyone online who would be willing to lead us in that. Just a few moments. If so, if you could just put up your hand, Jennifer, I will be able to see you.
I think we have a lot of stressed and overwhelmed people on this call.
Well, no worries.
Ellen, the question once more, what is it?
Yes, if someone would be willing to just lead us for you know, a few moments of just sort of grounding ourselves in this moment here together. Would that feel comfortable to you, Jessica, or you were just wondering?
You can give it a shot.
Thank you. I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure. All right, pretty people. We are where we are. So take a nice deep breath in and exhale. You can leave your eyes open or closed. Just take a couple breaths at your own pace. As you inhale, try to imagine that oxygen flowing through your body, doing all the good things that it does, because it is destined to do that. It is built to do that, to do the good work. And by doing that, by supporting that life, it gives you the life that you need to keep doing the good work. Take a couple of breaths, maybe one for gratitude, one for love, and one for light. And when you're done, just shake out some part of your body. Whether others can see it or not, it doesn't matter. Just send that energy somewhere. Just let that part of your body feel alive as you can. And when you're ready, direct that energy right back to your heart and then out somewhere Could be to someone you love, could be to a plant or a tree or a human being. Just send that energy out. And when you're ready, slowly and gently, as you inhale, open your eyes, and as you exhale, just take it all in one more time. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And it's always such a reminder of the incredible capacities that we hold as collectives. You know, there, Jessica spontaneously leads us in a beautiful moment. Thank you for doing that. Thanks for offering that to us. Yeah, so it's thrilling to be here, and I would like to say I have deep gratitude for speaking to you from the traditional territories of the Wasanics people. That's where I am today in a place now called Victoria, and I'm talking to you outside because of all the research that shows that being outside is just good for us no matter what. And I'm happy to say we have a health officer here in British Columbia who focuses very strongly on getting people outside because it's much healthier from a COVID spread foundation as well. So that's why I'm outside. And you might see some ducks running behind me. These are runner ducks. They're now 7 months old. They're about the same age as this network. They came almost as new ducklings when the network started. And so it's only right that they should be here with us. So what I wanted to do this morning, if it's all right with you, is that I would like to really speak to you for about 15 minutes, just really quickly on sort of key ideas that that I think are really important to this question of hope and how it influences our emotions around climate change and our engagement with that. And I hope that you'll notice that I reference some of the very people who are in this chat right now. And that's because so much of the work that we're collectively doing is so influential and so helpful to my thinking, and I think to each other's thinking. I hope that's true. And so if I would just like to say, if I've characterized your work in a less than nuanced way that you would like, just as Jennifer was saying, please let me know, and that can be a fruitful part of our conversation too. I'd really appreciate that. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen and jump in, and then I'd really love for us to have a conversation afterwards. And if you have any questions, I should say that one of my challenges is I can't see very well, so I probably won't see them in the chat while I'm talking, but Jennifer, if you could stop me or call them out, that would be grand. And otherwise, perhaps we could do them right at the end. Can everyone see my screen okay? Okay, great. So this is Hope Matters, and it just came out last week, as Jennifer said. And really, I wrote this book because I often run into this. Statements like this, often from people of all ages, but often from students. And I work in university settings and even with children very, very young. I'm a picture book writer too. So I will run into these really strong feelings of hopelessness as expressed in that sort of strong language. And to me, it's not surprising that we run into this. We see constantly headlines such as this one, a horrifying image of a sign about COVID burning in the middle of a fire, which was just a very recent thing. And you'll notice that all of the slides I show will be time-stamped. This is from October 4th, and I try to give my sources in each case is because one of the points I want to make is that keeping track of things as they're shifting is a critical aspect of hope. Now, because of this, we see really strong emotional reactions to our feelings about the state of the planet, about the state of climate change. And I just wanted to signpost this one. This is comparing research done on how crisis reporters feel when they're covering things like earthquakes and wars and famines, and how students talk about their feelings. And what I want to point out is just how similar and strong these feelings are. In fact, for a while now, I've been trying to collect terms that are appearing in our academic literature to try and name the range of feelings that we have in response to how we perceive the state of the planet. The point that I think is really important is that our feelings are real and they're a result of really urgent and critical and globally scaled issues. And they are also a reflection of the way in which what we learn about the climate and the planet comes to us. You know, our mindsets, which are shaped by what we feel and perceive and the narratives that we hear about that. So one of the collateral damages of doom and gloom is that it really does inspire hopelessness, and that hopelessness has strong connections with cynicism and apathy. And those who have been keeping track of cynicism around the world, we see a rise of cynicism and a rise of lack of trust occurring in many different parts of the world. At Yale, the Yale Program for Climate Change Communication, Anthony describes a hope gap. That's the space between this fears and concerns about climate and our feelings of powerlessness to do anything about it. And my dear friend and colleague, Elin Field, shared in her video as part of this Existential Toolkit, this work that she has recently done, showing that students are feeling, highly engaged, very aware, and yet this feeling that there's nothing they can do to change it. That's a real issue for our overall joint interest in this engagement with these critical problems. And I would argue that part of the reason we feel that is that almost everything we hear about climate change and other environmental issues is in a problem identification orientation, both within our journals, our academic journals that we share, and within mainstream press. And so Panu, who is with us today, did a really fascinating study where he was concluding, those of us who are environmental researchers are often inundated within those problems. And therefore we are suffering ourselves from these highly emotional reactions that we both knowingly and sometimes unknowingly are then passing on to our students and to others. And Panu, I'm sure you could add more to that, as could Elin in her work. We also see, there are a number of journalistic research projects that look at how is climate presented to the public, and that this is work done from Boulder, Colorado, that has been tracking and continues to track 117 media outlets across 55 countries. And we see overwhelmingly that problems are deemed more newsworthy than solutions. So this recognition of this issue of the characterization of this in media reporting has come to the point where media reports themselves are asking these kinds of questions. Are we somehow actively involved in the public disengagement of the very issues that we're seeking to do? Now, I don't have to say to this group, we all know this, that emotions matter very much to how we perceive the world and how we engage within it. And there's work arising that shows things like this, that although we've tended to work very much in the guilt and fear and shame realm in order to alert people to the urgency of issues, things like pride or compassion and empathy, relationships, meaningful purpose, these are all highly correlated with the ways in which we engage. And although fear and shame are important and are very influential in things like moving corporations, for example, to take action, they're not as tightly tied when it comes to personal engagement and the way we personally feel about issues. So this is a point that I feel strongly about. And I look to examples like this. So we know that back in 2019, we saw enormous responses to climate change. And I think for a lot of the students that we work with, they wonder, did anything come of that? Sometimes we wonder the same thing. Well, a lot came of that. In fact, as a result of those climate change movement, that those mass protests, we are now in a position where 1 in every 10 people on the planet lives in a place that has declared some form of climate emergency. And from that, those climate emergency declarations make statements about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's what they're focused on. And we see this translating into our political world. So this is just from September 25th, the Canadian government making statements about climate change. And we see in the United States, when President Trump said that the US was withdrawing from the climate change accord, which will happen tomorrow, we saw this response, which was a mobilization of those other actors within the United States saying, we're still in, we are still committed to those climate change agreements. And so we see these responses coming. I also think it's really helpful to think about age and values that spur from different peoples of different ages. What we know about this population of people from a number of studies is that the top priorities are social justice and climate change. They come out over and over and over again. We just see recently this report done on millennials and Generation Z, looking at both before COVID and now during COVID. And what we see is, if anything, an increased focus on societal issues and a commitment around putting people ahead of profits, social focus, and environmental sustainability. We also see research like this, which just came out this summer, which is looking at how things like COVID-19 shape up against concern around climate change. Now, when COVID first hit, there was a lot of concern that climate change would disappear. And I will say that in the media journalism research, there's a lot of talk about a media eclipse of COVID, which is when one issue is so dominant, we hear not much about other issues. And that did happen with COVID. And yet we see this continued focus with climate change. So again, if we don't think to look for change, we fail to see the shifts happening around us. And I think this is a critical issue for us in the environmental realm, because we're so used to knowing about environmental problems and to hearing about them. We can often feel like we don't need to check for new things because we kind of already know how bad it is. But my point is, we need, if anything, to be checking even more often. I'm a real believer in current time-stamped content and focusing on emerging trends that are heading in the directions we need them to be going. So for example, just in September, the UN Biodiversity Convention has been working hard to increase the percentage of protected areas. And so we see countries joining around this, a pledge to 25% by 2025 and 30% by 2030. And we see not only countries, but states, in this case, California, moving forward and making those pledges to that. Now, I'm in no way saying that that's a foregone conclusion. Of course, we must keep up political pressure around this. But when we see these numbers moving in that upward trajectory, that's a really important and positive sign. And it's also a sign that the UN Convention on Biodiversity and the UN Convention on Climate Change are working quite collaboratively in this realm of natural climate solutions, recognizing the two as intimately engaged with each other. Here in Canada, I'm happy to say that much of our work of protected areas has been driven by our Indigenous populations. And in fact, in the last 10 years, almost all of the national parks that were dedicated in Canada were Indigenous-led or co-created. I also see a big focus now on ecological restoration and actions such as this one with Prince William, looking at prize money going towards repairing of the planet. And in that 25% and 30% goals is not only the protection of wildlands, but also ecological restoration priorities. One of the areas I never used to look before, I would almost always look for positive trends within the scientific literature, is now the financial literature, the financial markets. So we see things such as this. And just earlier this month, 30 companies with $5 trillion in assets have joined on with a commitment to meeting the climate change accord. And that is happening because it's their shareholders driving investors in the direction of those priorities. And we're seeing that as a response in terms of the action of companies. And just last night, when I was searching for good news to share with you, or up-to-date news, we see this is a result of a case in Australia where, again, looking in terms of how our pension funds, huge investments, and how do they reflect these kinds of priorities that we have. And this is a current case going forward in Australia, but is reflective of a larger movement. We also see action in terms of businesses. And so IKEA just earlier this month has announced this initiative to buy back gently used products. It's part of this movement in terms of a circular life cycle for our goods. And just again, earlier this month, perhaps for some of your younger students, they may have an interest more in this, reusable packaging, which many of you on this call from other countries are much more familiar with, using packaging that comes back, but which is a new idea. And McDonald's, of course, in light of Burger King, has just announced the same thing. And we see a real movement towards recognizing the issues we have with single-use plastic. You know, we now have 138 countries that have signed on to some form of ban or tariffs or levies around single-use plastic. And during COVID-19, we saw some of those put on hold in the state of California, the country of Canada, and now off hold and back on trajectory. So I think this focus on single-use plastics is another trend that we see a lot of movement happening, and very much needed movement. So this is what I want to say. And in line with that, part of where I think we need to be focusing our attention with ourselves and our students is not only on our human actions, because we're so concerned about the state of the planet and what we do, which is right, and we should do that, but also there are 8.7 million other species on Earth who are actively responding to what's happening on the planet. And I think we need to focus on things such as humpback whales. You know, that we know that every population of humpback whales but 2 has been in a rapid increase, some back to their historic levels from before whaling. That when, and that's happening, I'm happy to say if you were to visit any of us on the West Coast, up in the Pacific Northwest, you might very much see humpback whales. They're very active. That's a good thing because the return of whales is very good for ocean ecosystems overall. In fact, people used to worry that if whales returned, you know, we'd have less fish for fisheries. The opposite occurs. Whales poop, they create nutrition, which, you know, feeds zooplankton. They also move a lot of water. And what's interesting about that is because they move a lot of water, they're sending phytoplankton up to the surface, the tiny plants that are photosynthesizing and capturing carbon. And we now find things like the International Monetary Fund putting price tags on the value of whales in terms of their carbon capture, as well as, you know, their impact on tourism and the positive impact on fisheries. So when we see movements like this, which just happened in July, and of course that extension now to 71 countries or 81 countries that we talked about earlier, making commitments to ocean and land protection, that's a good thing. And just a few days ago, research like this. Now that marine protected areas have been going on at an ecosystem scale for more than a decade, we're seeing more and more research coming out about what positive impacts they really do have in terms of ecological resilience. So fear and despair can often serve to mute our capacity to think collectively and to think creatively. And probably those of you who are feeling kind of nervous today know that to be true. You know, you tend to get isolated and you tend to think, you know, you can't think of anything creative. So we need to really be amplifying the solutions that are moving in the directions, and we need better ways of hearing about them. So I'm very happy that there's been this emergence in the last decade of the Solutions Journalism Network. It's really an amalgamator of media outlets that are doing journalism, or at least stories within their outlets, that are looking just as rigorously at what's working in an area as they are at what's broken in an area. And that rigorous reporting is an important part of it. It's not Pollyanna-ish good news. It's really saying, okay, what has worked successfully for gun violence, for example, in this place? And what about that might be tailored or used in another place? So it's a shift towards looking critically at solutions. We also have projects many of you will know, like Project Drawdown, that tries to amalgamate and say, what are the things that have the most impact when we collectively do them? And you'll notice, for example, wind turbines as number 2. And when you know that, when you see this report, it's much more compelling, because then you can put into context this shift in terms of its importance to the planet and to climate change. I myself was involved in co-creating a social media Twitter campaign, which has now moved to Instagram and others, which is crowdsourcing and sharing examples of ocean solutions. Now the Smithsonian Institution has an Earth Optimism campaign, which is large and very effective. There's conservation optimism, climate optimism. There's a number of these sorts of campaigns that are crowdsourcing and sourcing and sharing these kinds of solutions. That's important because we know that emotions are contagious. We know that face-to-face, and we also know that that's true online. And so when we are sharing things, we are either actively spreading hope or hopelessness, you know, that it's important to be aware of that. I think this is also a very important thing, that all of the work that I'm suggesting is that we absolutely accept the state that we're in, the urgency of our climate change conditions, the challenge of biodiversity, and yet the push to not become fatalistic about, because we know where we are, doesn't mean that's where the next thing is. And we need to be just as accepting about what things are shifting for the better. So in terms of spreading hope, oopsala, I'm just going to go back there. I was thinking for our group, we're so involved in university research and teaching. And often I've been thinking about students who say things like this to me. I don't know if that's true for you, but I think it's often true. And Jennifer and I were just talking at the beginning of this, that we're often brought into classes, or friends will ask us, can you come in and do that hopeful piece for us, as sort of this unusual treat in the middle. And they'll say to me, do you think you're better to come at the beginning or the middle or the end? Like, when should we do the hopeful thing? And I think that's not the right way through it. I'm happy to do that, but that's not the answer. And that's why I'm so pleased that we're coming together around this toolkit, because I think one of the critical things emerging from the toolkit and our joint things, and Robin Hutchings is online with us today, and she's the one who's doing the hard work of pulling together all our resources. Thank you, Robin. Is that we're really recognizing the importance of creating safe spaces for our feelings and finding ways of doing this. And Lisa, who's online today, I'm such a fan of all of your work. And of the work of so many of us across this network. So I think this is a really important aspect of this. And I really appreciate Lisa's focus on anger, that when we're talking about being hopeful, it doesn't mean you're also not highly pissed off or, deeply concerned, but hope can sit with these. I think there's a place for courses that are absolutely focused on hope or solutions orientations. And I guess this is the question then that I was hoping we could talk about together, is that how can we collectively, create these safe spaces to share emotions, both with our students, our colleagues, our friends? How do we bring this timestamp content and examples of positive emerging trends? And how do we bring these current examples of agency and resilience in other species into our daily teaching to engage students in empowering transformative change? When Ellen Field was talking about, these students feeling there's absolutely nothing they can do, she was looking at that through the lens of an empowerment evaluation, that their students' sense of self-efficacy and empowerment. And clearly that's an issue that we need to be collectively addressing. So I'm going to stop there and turn back to all of you. Thank you very much. Oops.
So if folks want to ask any questions or contribute comments or ideas, please go ahead and raise your hand. And I like was that a C star, Andrea? Oh, okay, perfect. I need some more props on Zoom to respond in these very visual ways. Yeah, feel free to go ahead and put your hand up, or if you want to put a question in the chat, if you are not able to speak or are not comfortable, and I can certainly elevate that and put that question out there. So I see that Anya Gali Robertson, and if you could also introduce yourselves as well.
Yeah.
So Anya, do you want to go ahead?
Hi everyone, I'm Anya Gali Robertson. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Dayton. And I teach intro level basic social science classes on climate change every semester. So I've got 50 students this semester. We talk a lot about emotion, both from the psychology standpoint and from the organizing and emotional standpoint. We talk a lot about emotion. And one thing that I am running into is that students are really protecting themselves from disappointment. And that is something that I have a harder time responding to, because I feel like that's a very fair adaptive response for Generation Z to be having. And so I'm just wondering how people manage that in their classes, or Ellen, if you have any responses to that. But I see that students, not only are they responding to these doom and gloom narratives, but they also, when they think about getting involved or the capacity for action or taking those steps toward active hope, they don't want to do that and then see it fail, or they don't want to do that and then be disappointed in what older generations are failing to do, I guess. So
I can start, and then I would really love to hear what others have to say. There's a couple of things. One of the things I was exploring in this book is this idea of hope as a future orientation, and often that's how we think about it. And hope is, as many of you will be well familiar, has been a term that has been around for thousands of years, and in the written literature and much longer in oral traditions. And so there are many different interpretations of hope and many different ideas about hope. But some that I find helpful are, for example, in the palliative care literature, there's this sense of hope as a meaningful present. And I think that can be quite effective for those who are not feeling like they are able to think about the future in a positive way at this moment. I also think it's interesting in the popular culture, this idea of hope punk. So that's contrasted against grim, dark, and noble, bright narratives. Noble, bright is when someone will come and save us, and grim, dark is dystopian. We kind of are familiar with that from lots of films. And hope punk has been emerging in the last few years as this idea of, regardless of what happens, you're going to act in the way that you believe the world should be. And I find that hope punk has a lot of resonance, often in some ways similar to that palliative care literature that's focusing on the here and now and how I'm going to be, regardless of where this might go. That can be sometimes a way when it's too prickly to move into future orientation. But I'd love to turn it to others.
Can I say something?
Jennifer, are you?
Yes, I'm sorry about that. I was muted. Yes, please, Heidi.
Okay, so first, some great news from Austria. I'm Heidi, and I'm at the University of Salzburg, and we just won the the second spot, Sustainability Award 2020 for our future Lectures for Future series, which we started last year. And it's part of the Fridays for Future movement, and professors at different universities. Can you hear me? Okay, professors at different universities in Austria went together and gave talks. I, for example, covered the Anthropocene, storytelling in the Anthropocene, and in that context also talked about, the kind of emotions we evoke with the kind of stories we tell. So that's my take on it. My background is eco-criticism and environmental humanities. Yeah, and I have a more general question here. For those of you who are working with the concept Anthropocene, does any of you, because this year they had a gathering, I believe, I don't know if it took place, where Ian Salasiewicz, however you pronounce him, and others talked about how the Anthropocene should be defined and when it should start and when it should end. And why, if we should call it officially like a new age. So does any of you have information on that? And in what context do you guys use the concept Anthropocene? Thank you.
If nobody has any thoughts on, oh, Krista had her hand up.
I can't really pronounce it or say it clearly, but and when I wake up a little bit more, there's the Chthulhucene. I'm gonna hold that thought, and I'm gonna just look at my bookshelf for a minute. But there is one thing I would.
I think that's Donna Haraway's.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think most of us struggle with that word.
So thinking about communities of life, not thinking of humans necessarily as a controlling agent, but problematizing the very notion of the human as already always embedded with other life forms and processes. So, I mean, I think there's probably some crossover there with Ellen's work, just in talking about the reciprocal relations between humans and the natural world. But Panu also has his hand up on this, possibly on this topic. Panu.
Yeah, thanks, Elin, and very good to see you all, folks. So it's Panu Pihkala from University of Helsinki, Finland. It's evening, but not totally late here. A brief comment to the Anthropocene thing. Susie Moser commented with a link, and there's also this critical discussion about who has the right to define a word for the age of humans and so on. So that kind of socio-critical literature is going on also and can be found online. But sort of responding to Elin's questions and partly to Susie's comments, we do have a session I promised to host one in a couple of weeks where the explicit topic is difficult emotions. So there'll be some continuation of that. My experience is that because some students have a quite pessimistic outlook and some have pretty optimistic outlook, and what is often very important is to try to encounter the feelings of grief and guilt. Now, this is very familiar for many of us present, but I wanted to say it out loud, because especially among students of environmental disciplines, I encounter a lot of, welled up grief or complicated grief, ambiguous loss, and there are many forms of this. And unless that is somehow encountered, it's very difficult for them to practice any countering of the negativity bias or the negativity instinct, to borrow some of the phrasings of Hans Rosling, the Swedish scientist. Now, I've been greatly influenced by both Susie Moser's and Elin's work, and I think that Elin's work might sound more optimistic, philosophically speaking, than it actually is. There is this palliative care dimension, and finding meaning in the moment, and at least regardless of our actual optimism or pessimism, I think that what we can and should do is to try to help people to overcome the negativity bias and at least see the reality more as it is, as a combination of good and bad. Yeah, just some thoughts.
Sorry.
Oh, and Ellen, if you want to respond to that too, there was another question from Susie that kind of builds on some of the other questions as well.
Susie, go ahead, please.
And Susie, if you're, there was an earlier comment. I don't know if you were able to turn your audio on, but if not, I can read this question. Okay, I'll go ahead and read her question because I don't see her actually on screen. She wrote, I'm wondering whether your suggested focus on evidence of positive change is doomed to fail itself. Cornel West once said, optimism is a notion that there's sufficient evidence that if we keep doing what we're doing, things will get better. Hope is the courage to act when doubt is warranted. What's your reaction to that? And does that not imply that we need to look somewhere completely different than the comeback of humpback whales? If anybody wants to reference that, it's about halfway up in the chat from Susie Moser.
Yeah, thanks, Susie. And I also see just a little bit farther down, you mentioned you're not in a good spot in terms of speaking on camera. So thank you for that. Yeah, I think the part that's maybe important to this that I'm not sure I always say as well as I wish I did, is that if we keep track of people's concern about the climate and their awareness of climate change, and in Ellen Field's work, that's what she was doing, and showing that people are aware, in her case with these high school students or students between grade 7 and 12, they are aware and they are concerned. And when we look across the literature, there's quite a lot of surveys being done internationally and, of course, within local contexts that look at this rise of climate awareness and climate concern. We see it in the United States right now. Climate awareness and concern are at record high levels. So when we think in that way, then I think we're in a very different position than we were in even a while ago, when our number one priority was to raise climate awareness and raise climate concern. So as that shift is happening, I think it changes what we should be focused upon. So if we say we accept now that climate awareness and concern is high, and that there's still lots of work to do in that area. I'm not saying that in any way, but what I am saying is because of the work that's being done in that area, and because we focus so highly on those problems, we're not recognizing this, the outcome of continuing to hear about problems when you're already concerned and you're already really aware, causes a situation that creates a lot of the anxiety that we're talking about. And I think that's why it behooves us to think more about, I often say, if you look in medical journals, for example, you see lots of information about terrible health issues, and you see lots of information about what's the response to those terrible health issues that is being done by that professional community involved with it, right? And then the challenge of, is that response effective or not? Is that, in what ways is that working? Where did that work in this population and not that one? I look here in Canada, I just heard the National Health Officer talking about, today, 80% of Canadians are wearing masks. That wasn't true 7 months ago. And that's been done on a range of different ways. Some places mandated, some places voluntary, some places this, and, but we do talk about shift, and I think that that's one of the things that when I look at other fields, like, for example, dealing with major drug addiction problems, right? We see a lot of shifts in the way that we talk to the public about how we think about that issue, making it more awareness as a health issue rather than, or decriminalizing, or, so there's healthy debate about where productive steps forwards can happen. And I think what I'm suggesting is that we don't have that same healthy debate, because I think we're so afraid that if we don't keep talking about how broken this thing is, we'll somehow create complacency. But what I see us doing is inadvertently creating a lot of apathy. And I think that's not where we want to be. And I think that's why I'm saying, I'm not, humpback whales are just one of many examples, but I think they're important examples. We know right now there's a lot of issues and interest because of ecological restoration around tree planting. And I'm happy to see a lot of discussion around what happens when we actively plant trees versus what happens when we just leave areas to regrow, and some very interesting findings around the resilience because of the social networks between trees, right, and other plants, between their roots and their microfungal networks, that shows that when you leave trees collectively to restore, there's a lot of benefit to that, and so people thinking about the agency of trees and forests at the same time as they're thinking about replanting of trees in order to create forests. So I think those are healthy discussions, and that's really what I'm trying to signpost.
I love that. Doreen and then Lisa Kretz both have their hands up, so we could go in that order.
Hi everyone. Thanks so much, Ellen. And yeah, as always, these conversations provoke so many thoughts, and yeah, they're really generative. So thanks for that. Some of the place where I'd love to just sort of put out there, and maybe it follows along a little bit on Susie Moser's comment about unwarranted optimism. So one of the slides that you showed about the students' quote about, for the first half of the class, we talk about how doomed we all are, and then we're expecting those solutions. And, I ended up in the middle of a class sort of like that, and recognizing that that's where my students were, and I wasn't actually planning to do anything sort of further to help get them out of that. As I say, I think I was leading them off the cliff. But what I did do at that point in the class then is I created a new module which looks at, and it really looks at futures gaming folks and thinking about, and I use this one quote from Stuart Candy, because the future is unwritten, it is plural. And I gave students a lot of tools and ways to sort of think about the different ways that we get into that future. And one of the things that let me just sort of throw out here and maybe problematize a little bit this question of hope, because for me, hope, you know, I read bits and pieces of Donna Haraway's book, and she says neither hope nor despair is a sensible attitude. And I have trouble with that word hope. So I'm really happy to have you sort of make me engage more with that word. One of the things that I think about is sort of the different sort of theories of change. Like, how do you get students how do you empower students, right? How do you empower people in this situation of like a really challenging situation of climate change? How do you help them think about different ways that change happens and also situate themselves as agents of change? And now sort of I spend a lot of time with my analysis is a political economy analysis or a political ecology analysis of climate change. And the word solutions really sort of drives me a bit nuts when we talk about trees as climate solutions, as like the classic example right now, because the climate solution is stopping the burning of fossil fuels. And whenever we talk about solutions in that very sort of positive green nature kind of way, we take our eyes off of where we actually, like, what is the actual driver of climate change? It's fossil fuel burning. And how do we, within this discourse of hope and sort of positivity, also keep a focus on, like, what do we have to change? We have to change a fossil dependent economy. And maybe we have to have bad actors, and maybe we have to name names. And so anyway, sorry, that was a bit long. But let me just throw that out there and see if there's any sort of reflections that come back.
Yeah, thank you, Doreen. I really appreciate how you're sharing that. And I think I find myself often trying to talk in the present rather than the future as one of my ways of thinking about empowerment. So rather than saying how do we change our fossil dependent things, I'm more likely to say we are changing our fossil dependent, and to point then to this shift, for example, towards renewables, and to look at that, like, what evidence do we have that we are in fact in that transition already and need more of it? You know, so it's the pointing to where we are because of these actions, rather than staying so much in the future. If only we did this, then this might happen. That's something I try to do a lot of, and it's challenging often because it forces me then to find the evidence that I might use. And if I can't find that evidence, then I can't say that. And so it's, in some ways, it's a bit of a challenge personally to myself to do that. And then I think the other thing is there's some very interesting journalism research that shows when an article points to those things, you know, people in this community are doing this thing in light of this critical problem, that the research shows that people are much more likely to feel that they could do something too than when that piece is not in there. And it's something, in looking at 2017 and 2018 across how climate change is reported in major US newspapers, it's less than 18% of all of that reporting that is in that frame, that piece is missing. And so without that piece, it's very easy then to assume it must be missing because it doesn't exist, because no one is doing anything. And that's why I'm so much pushing, I think, the sense of what does exist and how do we make that more obvious, because we are getting a lot of what's broken and needs to be fixed. And that's important. I'm not in any way saying that's not important. I'm just saying we need this other piece right alongside and with it.
So we've got a few minutes left here. I want to get Lisa up on the screen, and then after that, Peter also had a comment or a question. Go ahead, Lisa.
All right, so I wanted to start by offering just a profound sense of gratitude for this discussion. I find it so grounding and so energizing. So when I raised my hand, it was in response to Susie's comment, so I'm going to circle back. I think when we're talking specifically about Cornell West's analysis of hope, we have to be really sensitive to context. So the conversations we have about hope, I think, when you're talking about it in the context of race, that's a specific conversation. When you're talking about it in the context of the environment, that's a specific conversation. And sort of teasing apart and being very clear about our definition of hope, I think can be really helpful here. It's a messy concept and different people have radically different ideas about what it entails. So by sort of creating that focus, I think that affords clarity. And I think with regard to Ellen's work, it's a question of what makes the most effective strategy for activism. And when you're looking at the psychology of activism, hopeful engagement motivates people. So there's this really practical aspect to that question as well. So thanks.
Peter, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, thanks. I'm Peter Friederisi. I'm at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona, and I want to, thanks for having the series. It's great and stimulating, and thanks to Ellen for hosting us today and for modeling living outdoors, which I'm doing too. But I think my starting point with this is that I teach students who are master's students. They're highly motivated, they're highly passionate, they care about this stuff a lot, and we regularly have debates in the classroom about the disjunct between the point that we always get to in the classroom, because we talk about the interconnection of so many issues, and the conclusion that is reached is often, well, we have to turn the whole system over. You know, we have to get rid of capitalism. We have to do all this, and then linking that to we have a curricular requirement for engagement for them, and so they're doing an internship with the city or something like that, doing a sustainability project, and it's very difficult for them to make a connection between these two massively different scales. So that's sort of my starting point for seeing what the difficulty is for students. These are graduate students. But I think what I'm exploring now, and this is in some writing that I'm doing, is looking at the nature of tragedy, and in particular, I'm looking at a literary critic, Joseph Meeker, whom some of you may know, who is a literary scholar and also a field biologist, and he did some really interesting writing looking at the nature of tragedy versus the nature of comedy, and basically posited that tragedy is inherently top-down, and tragedy is inherently about a split between people and nature. And so to me, that resonates a lot, that whenever we get into tragic narratives, we maybe are, without thinking about it, slipping into the narrative that the stories that we get from top down are the valid frame, right? That the economy has to keep growing, for example, and we can't consider anything else. So what Joseph Meeker calls for is much more a much more comic approach, and really looking at comedy as a literary and performative tradition that can be much more democratic and much more unpredictable, and can get away from this really hierarchical way of thinking that is embodied in tragedy. So I think that's very promising. I think that's something that resonates with young people, because everybody loves comedy, and we know how it works, you know, from Trevor Noah and many other examples. But then applying that to these giant issues that we face. And because Joseph Meeker was also a field biologist, he wrote specifically about looking at evolution as a model for comedy. You know, and to me, this gets back to Ellen's point about looking at other species, you know, because if there's anything in the world that's comic, I mean, it is evolution, right? I mean, just look at this amazing diversity out there. And so I think that's a good model, because the model of evolution is there's not really a master plan. It's let's try everything and we'll see what works. So I think this kind of analogical thinking between this world of biology or ecology and literature is a really promising way to go.
I love that. That's a great comment. I want to respect Ellen's time. Ellen, would you have time for maybe one more question from Jessica? Just so since she started us off with the breathing exercise, I feel like we'll let her have the last breath here, maybe.
Of course, absolutely. And if people want to stay on and continue, I just, my mind is buzzing. I really appreciate this. So yes, thank you.
Thanks, I appreciate it. I'm just thinking about like how we're training hope, like what it takes to sort of like build that muscle up. And I'm wondering, a lot of my students in particular, it feels reactive. Like we talk about hope when they're feeling down. And so I'm wondering if there are really like more offensive ways to be training hope, or if you've come across any of this, or if there are tactics or things that you use that anyone on this call has had success with, or sand traps to avoid, or anything like that.
Such a wonderful question. And I know Krista Neff talks a lot about how we can learn self-compassion. You know, you can, she does a lot of work in that area, and there's now institutes on kindness. And, you know, I think Stanford's Mind Body Lab thinks a lot about the ways in which we, you know, our mindsets determine these things. So I think I would love to talk to you more about that, and to look at, you know, where we see examples from these other fields. I think the whole mindfulness and compassion area has worked very hard at imagining an interpretation of that might sit within this idea of skills development, you know, and again, it comes back to your interpretation of hope. You know, is it again, within the palliative care literature would say it's just inherently within us, you know, and so it doesn't even fall to teachers or physicians to worry about false hope, because hope exists within it. It's just there. And part of the challenge of that is supporting those so that one can find one's way back to that, you know, and others who look at hope theory, for example, see it very much as a set of skills of which one can acquire over time. So I think it's, in asking the question, it's a great way to think about, is it a blend of those, one, another, or many other things? Yeah, but I'd love to talk to you more about that, Jessica, and I'd love to hear what others have to say about that too.
And in the chat, Laura Hill also made a reference to Joanna Macy's Active Hope and the gratitude practices, basically, as another way to fortify those skills proactively and throughout conversations and contexts. Any other last thoughts on that particular question of proactively cultivating hope before we wrap up? And again, if anybody does want to reach out and get the text transcript from me, I did have this recorded, so if you want to share that with others, we'll put it on the Existential Toolkit website in the coming days. But I can also get the chat to you if there were any resources there that you wanted to go back and revisit.
Yeah, I'm Larry Delos. I'm actually in New Hampshire. And I just wanted to mention, in response to that question, just a very brief insight that I had some time ago that relates, I think, to this. And it's a somewhat mystical stance, but I think that part of the problem lies with a distinction between self and other that we make. And that's a valuable and important way of viewing the world. But there also is a moment when it helps to dissolve that distinction. And when we realize that hope may not be something that we have or don't have, so much as the reality that like a leaf of grass, we are hope. We simply are hope. That's what it means to be a living being, is to live through and to cling to and work and live on behalf of life itself. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
I had sort of a comment around sort of instructional strategies or pedagogical approaches, thinking through this around hope. And one of the ways that sort of I've started to experiment with this is actually just asking students in the beginning, what are you worried about? And what questions do you want to answer? And then what gives you hope? And then from there, we sort of look at these big maps, whether we do it virtually this semester or previously we would do it on a wall. And then from there, we basically can build a course. And so it's a much more sort of responsive, experiential approach. And generally, I kind of mock up my course outline so that there are sort of these big thematic weeks, but I very much create that openness, because if we approach it, I think, as instructors, as these are the things you have to know, then we lose that opportunity for that initial question asking, and then for students to own the learning. And then that's where hope happens. That's where, they will explore the issues, but they will also have so much energy and enthusiasm to direct the learning. And they will, you gear them towards finding this sort of solutions orientation. But I really think at the university, it has its you have to kind of be creative. But I think looking at the last year, along with the research I did, we also did a national curriculum review in Canada. And, when you look at the curriculum in that way, it is so focused on the impacts. And when you look at what is taught, there's very little on solutions orientation at all. And so just finding ways to create that openness. But I think really, for me, the most basic thing is asking students, what do you want to learn about? And then build the course from there, where you can bring your expertise to meet the questions that they have to ask. So I'll just share that as a way to sort of open it up and to provide that space. But thanks for this conversation. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. I'm going to probably wrap up here because I actually also need to jump off to another meeting, and this is my Zoom call. But I want to remind everybody that you can hop back on with us in 2 weeks. I think, Panu, you're up next. The schedule for all of our speakers is on the Existential Toolkit.com webpage. And yeah, please check out Ellen's book as well, Hope Matters. It sounds like she has much more to say, and I could listen to her or read her all day long. So rather than keeping her on Zoom, I'm going to go out and get your book, Ellen. But thank you so much for talking to us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer. And thank you to everyone. I find these conversations so meaningful. I get moved, and then it's hard to speak because I think one thing I really do believe is that it's this, our collective is so important, both amongst each other and with other species. I was really touched by Larry's comment. And so thank you. It's great to talk to you.
Wonderful.
And I look forward to joining in for Panu's section in 2 weeks' time. Thank you to everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you.